This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'm Sheridan Marshall, and my paper is called Maternal and Religious Disappointment in Contemporary German Language Women's Fiction. So this paper is about the relationships between maternal and religious disappointment in 3 literary texts by contemporary female authors writing in German. My attempts to draw connections between women's maternal and religious disappointment in these texts will be relevant for 4 of the research questions for this workshop, and I've listed them on the handout. Questions 4, 7, 8 and 10. The 3 novels I will consider were all published last year, and they are Landgericht, or State Justice, by Ursula Krechel, which won the prestigious German Book Prize last year. That's Germany's equivalent of the Man Booker over here. Außer sich is the second one, Beside Himself, by Ursula Fricker, which was shortlisted for the 2012 Swiss Book Prize. And finally, Vielen Dank für das Leben, or The Gift of Life, by Sibylle Berg, which was also on the shortlist for last year's Swiss Book Prize. All 3 novels, though, are set in Germany, so that's the relevant national context for research question 4. The English word disappointment frames my thinking about the connections between 21st century literary depictions of motherhood and religion. The definition from the shorter Oxford English Dictionary is on the handout, and for the purposes of this paper I'm concerned with the first 2 senses of the word. So 1, disappointment as an instance of the frustration or non-fulfillment of desire or expectation, and 2, disappointment as the dejection or distress caused by this. In spite of their differences, the portrayals of motherhood and religion in the literary texts I consider exhibit a shared concern with the ways in which both types of experience may be characterised in terms of frustration and non-fulfillment, i.e. disappointment. Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is a long, largely male canon of philosophical and literary writing about religious disappointment, spanning Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Beckett, with a lot of others in between, which addresses both the disillusionment of individual spiritual experiences as well as frustration with institutionalised religion. In his 1997 book, Very Little, Almost Nothing, the British philosopher Simon Critchley aptly summarises what is at stake in the sort of Judeo-Christian religious disappointment which is the grounding for much modern philosophical thinking. And this is quotation A on the handout. Critchley says, "Religious disappointment is born from the realisation that religion is no longer, presuming it ever was, capable of providing a meaning for human life. This is the type of religious disappointment which recurs in the contemporary German language texts I'm considering here. For example, in Beside Himself, Ursula Fricker writes, quotation B, "God is not an authority who can be called to account." Similarly, in Sibylle Berg's The Gift of Life, she writes, see quotation C, "It was a difficult life in the small socialist country without gods to collect the world together into stories. Gods who would have imposed a comprehensive order on millions of parallel lives and divined a purpose for them." Alongside this knowing critical awareness of the impossibility of religious fulfillment in the novels, or to put it another way, the inevitability of religious disappointment, there is also an implicit nostalgia for the presumed religious fulfillment of the past. So that's a brief introduction to religious disappointment. I'm now just going to talk generally about maternal disappointment, which is a recurring theme in feminist writing about motherhood. So Adrian Rich's Of Woman Born, we've just heard about, and Rachel Cusk's A Life's Work are 2 seminal titles which characterise the disappointment of being a mother, both in terms of losing a prior sense of oneself that has existed before motherhood, and in terms of a disconnection between personal experiences of motherhood and the collective ideal or institution of motherhood. In the foreword to her book, in lines which are quoted by Cusk, Adrian Rich also cites disappointment as a crucial aspect of the child's experience of being mothered. This is quotation D. Most of us first know both love and disappointment, power and tenderness in the person of a woman. The literary depictions of motherhood in the 3 novels I am considering are each concerned with different limit experiences of motherhood. So this first book, State Justice, is about a mother who's been separated from her children who've grown up in another culture. The second novel, Beside Himself, is about hypothetical motherhood. And in the third novel, the situation is that children are continually rejected by their mothers. The characters in the novels reflect perceptively on the constructed nature of maternal identity. Motherhood is not an unquestioned category of experience. For example, in Krechel's State Justice, the protagonist's pride following the birth of their first child is tempered by the knowledge that, quotation E, motherhood and fatherhood were not reflexes which functioned timelessly and unconditionally. So as with the portrayal of religious experience, while the characters in these books are very knowing about the potential disappointments of maternal experience, they remain nostalgic for a presumed sense of historic maternal fulfillment and they're disappointed by its contemporary impossibility. Both spiritually and maternally, the characters in these novels are disappointed by their disappointment. Right. Now I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of all 3 books in this context. The first one, State Justice. Ursula Krechel's novel, State Justice, is about a married couple who are persecuted by the Nazis, focusing on their struggle to rebuild their lives after the end of the Second World War. The novel contributes to an understanding of the relationship between motherhood and religion, admittedly prior to 1968, because both maternal and religious experiences are central to the sufferings that its female protagonist, Claire Kornitzer, undergoes at the hands of the Nazis. Claire, a Protestant, is married to a Jew, Richard Kornitzer, and even though Richard's mother would have rather seen her son marry a Jewish girl, the couple's different religious backgrounds initially seem irrelevant. But then, in April 1933, Richard Kornitzer is barred from the legal profession for being a Jew, despite never having practiced his religion. As the Nazi regime makes itself felt in all aspects of their lives, their religious identities assume heightened significance. And fearing for the safety of their half-Jewish children, the couple send them to England on one of the Kindertransports, aged just 4 and 7. Although the couple managed to locate their children after the war, their family life is irrevocably damaged, and the children never truly accept their mother and father again. In a sense, then, the Nazis' persecution of Claire Kornitzer reduces her whole identity to that of a disappointed mother, a mother who has been permanently traumatized by enforced separation from her half-Jewish children. Claire's position as a frustrated and disappointed mother of absent children is brought about by the Nazis' persecution of her husband and children for their religious identities as Jews and half-Jews. Throughout the novel, it is the loss of her children who, even when she is reunited with them, remain permanently estranged from her, rather than the loss of her career or damage to her relationship with her husband, which counts as the defining aspect of the multifaceted suffering inflicted by the Nazis. Claire experiences the loss of maternal responsibility as a primal disappointment, an unspeakably great pain. And a quotation F on the handout is from her. The pain was too great, exceedingly great, a vast wound that would never heal, an unending silence. Maternal disappointment is intimately connected with religious identity in this novel, and the huge erosion of religious faith that occurred as a consequence of the desolation of World War II and the Holocaust in particular contributes to the widespread untenability of Judeo-Christian religious belief in contemporary German language and other European literature, I think. Right, novel number 2, Beside Himself. Ursula Fricker's novel, Beside Himself, tells the story of a pair of architects, Sebastian and Katja, living in Berlin and devoted to one another. The couple are in their early 40s, and it initially appears that they have been content in their decision not to have children. Katja states, and this is quotation G on the handout, I had never wanted children. I couldn't see any place in our lives for children. The idea of and I think this is really funny, the idea of spending hours in playgrounds where dozens of other mothers and fathers observed their offspring's burgeoning social skills did not strike me as charming, but rather as pretty depressing. The theme of the couple's childlessness steadily takes on more significance in the novel, however. Katya recounts numerous instances of being asked by friends when they might start a family and why they haven't had any children yet. Questions like these loom large as seemingly the only topic of conversation it's possible to have with a childless woman in her 30s. It emerges that Sebastian would like children, but that Katya disagrees. Early on in the novel, however, she reconsiders the idea and she imagines an idyllic version of maternal fulfillment, which is quotation H, in which I would see the world differently with a child. Flowers, clouds in the sky. I would walk more slowly because children are always finding something on the ground that they have to pick up. She describes then a momentous decision to start a family with Sebastian after their 20-year relationship. But within hours of Katya reaching her decision to become a mother, and before she has been able to tell Sebastian, he suffers a cerebral aneurysm which puts him in a coma in intensive care. And when he awakens, he has lost almost all cognitive function, and his life is reduced to the most basic bodily functions. He has to be taught how to walk and how to feed himself, and he can no longer speak or communicate in any way. He no longer even seems to recognise Katya. The rest of the novel documents Katya's doomed attempts to nurse Sebastian back to his former self, interspersed with her memories of their former life. Katya connects her stolen vision of a hypothetical future with Sebastian in which they would have had a child with an image of a spiteful God who laughs at her for daring to imagine the maternal happiness which she has previously rejected. And this is quotation I. I tried with all my might not to imagine how wonderfully normal our lives could have been. Presumably we would have had a child by now. Sebastian would be working less. We would have been a family, sitting in the playground. So that suddenly appeals to you now, ha-ha, a God sat above me laughing into his fist. The maternal disappointment in this book then, in Katya's initial rejection of a maternal role and subsequently being denied the possibility of being a mother, is connected with her idea of a cynical God. And this cynical God recurs throughout the book, also in relation to her partner's aneurysm and the impossibility of religious fulfillment. So at one point Katya declares, I think about many things, just not about God. But this is emphatically not true. There are frequent references to God throughout the book, which, as in the other two novels I'm considering, are largely figured in terms of his inattentiveness, inadequacy, distance or absence, all versions of religious disappointment. When paired with the equally frequent references to Katya's childlessness, this suggests that her life and her maternal disappointment is in some sense being governed by her religious disappointment. Religious disappointment has become almost a faith position in itself, and perhaps maternal disappointment has become a default expectation of contemporary motherhood. Right, novel number 3, The Gift of Life. Sibylle Berg's The Gift of Life. This is a shocking and disturbing book which describes the desolate and tormented life of a hermaphrodite called Toto, who was born to an alcoholic mother in the former East Germany during the 1960s. Toto's mother cannot cope with looking after her baby, and after some devastating descriptions of maternal neglect, Toto is committed to a children's home where he is treated appallingly by the carers and other children. After being sold to a pair of violent alcoholic farmers, Toto escapes to West Germany where he fares little better. Toto eventually adopts a female identity which suits her better, but she continues to be treated brutally by everyone with whom she comes into contact. Unsurprisingly, given its relentlessly bleak outlook, maternal and religious disappointment are both very pronounced in Berg's novel. If mothers are there at all, they are disempowered, unloving, and profoundly unfulfilled by their maternal role. And this relation is passed down through successive generations. As in the previous two books, appeals to God are made, but he is found absent or wanting. And this is quotation K. Where should he be, this God, this higher being? None of those present gave any consideration to the metaphorical significance of an overarching moral authority. If anything, then they believed in a man with a beard, and he was not someone you could go and see. The book's title, The Gift of Life, might in other contexts suggest a thankful relation to both maternal and divine agencies which are thought to bring about life, but here points ironically to the futility and disappointment of both. And now, to conclude, I've tried to show that there are connections, especially in these three contemporary German language texts, between religious disappointment in the sense of Judeo-Christian religion no longer having the capacity to give meaning to human life, and different types of maternal disappointment in which women are variously deprived of their capacity for maternal fulfillment. The novels I have considered all illustrate the German national context, but I think that this interrelation of maternal and religious disappointment would also apply to other Western European cultures. Religious disappointment generates the sense of profound disorientation for people, as shown in the quotations I've presented here about God's absence or inattentiveness. And this disorientation has an impact across different areas of people's lives, including upon the maternal role. Maternal disappointment, which is sometimes also expressed as a sense of disorientation, is not necessarily a consequence of religious disappointment. But in the literary texts I have introduced here, maternal disappointment is often articulated in relation to religious disappointment. The frustration of both maternal and religious relations in these books means that neither is able to gain support or orientation from the other. For some consolation, we might turn back to the philosopher Simon Critchley, whose book, The Faith of the Faithless, published in 2012, the same year as the literary text I have considered here, tries to find in a collective faithlessness the same sort of unifying ground for society as used to be offered by religious belief. Critchley reverses Dietrich Bonhoeffer's idea of a religionless Christianity, or God without religion, to ask, in quotation L, how we speak of religion as that force which can bind human beings together in association without God. Critchley's answer is developed in terms of asking how best to promote an openness to love. For faith cannot endure without love. He characterises this love as an infinite demand which entails, I think this is my last quotation M, entails giving what one does not have and receiving that over which one has no power. And I think that sounds like a very apt description of maternal love. The maternal conceptions of disappointment I have outlined in the literary texts here rarely entail a lack of maternal love, with the notable exception of Berg's The Gift of Life. And neither is maternal love in doubt in the accounts of disappointed motherhood given by Rich and Kusk. It is this loving requirement to fulfill an infinite demand towards others, authorised by the subject themselves, which contains the potential to offer a way out of both maternal and religious disappointment. Love as an ethical relation which is practiced not for God's sake, but for the sake of the individual subject, offers a potential way out of our collective disappointment and a means towards collective fulfilment. Although, living as we do in the midst of this disappointment, in the context of what for many is a residual, untenable religious Judeo-Christian faith, and without socially workable models of motherhood which are not riddled with contradictions, this path remains unclear. Thank you.